Solving the synoptic problem is a difficult mystery. It's like Sherlock Holmes. There are many facets to the problem, and it's really hard to come up with a solution that convinces everyone. But to my way of thinking though, and I think to Father Wargle, who would agree with me, not every proposed solution is equally likely. But in trying to decide between the three main hypotheses of J.J. Griesbach, the two-source hypotheses and the Ferrer hypotheses, we can begin to eliminate certain possibilities at the outset. Let's start with Griesbach. Again, that's the theory that Matthew wrote first, then Luke came along and wrote second, and then Mark came along third and pulled together Matthew and Luke, synthesizing them. Now this theory seems exceedingly unlikely to me, and I will tell you why. Actually, 8 reasons why. The first is the literary style of Mark. It's pretty clear Mark does not write Greek as well as Matthew or Luke. That's pretty much the conclusion of just about everyone who's tried to read Mark in the original Greek. Don't trust me though. We've got a Greek course here at CDU. You can be reading Mark and Matthew by the end of the second semester. Take a look yourself. But again, the big objection to this is subjectivity. We could say, well, on what criteria could you say that Matthew is really better written than Mark? I mean, who are we to say that Fitzgerald is a better author than Hemingway, or Daniel Defoe is a better author than Nathaniel Hawthorne? Now that objection would hold if we were talking about literary merit just in the abstract, but in this case we have 2 works that are similar in language and content and are both written in a very Semitically accented Greek, different in some respects from Koine Greek of the time. In such a case, people are indeed going to come to a wide agreement that, yeah, given these 2 immigrants writing a second language, immigrant B does have a better handle on the language than immigrant A. Of course, that doesn't prove anything. That's only suggestive, however, not probative. A lesser writer could borrow from a better one, sort of a Pygmalion in reverse. I mean, that's not that unusual. Frequently, higher students turn in bad writing, having drawn from sources that are actually well written, with papers that are written badly. So it can go the other way. But what's the issue with Mark's writing? Well, there's a lot of grammatical awkwardness. The excessive use of terms like and immediately and again. This is actually hard to see fully in translation. Many translations, in fact, drop some of the ands and agains for good English form. Mark also loves the word immediately and uses it so much that it begins to lose its effectiveness. In parallels, Matthew uses it far less often. Mark actually writes a lot of his stories back in the present tense when he's telling stories, when Matthew and Luke do it much more rarely. Again, nearly all modern translations will fix Mark's present tense for better form in English, but telling stories in the present tense at oral is something that oral storytellers tend to do. Though less polished, this might actually indicate greater proximity to the oral tradition on the part of Mark. The second reason is the Aramaic words, the Aramaisms. Mark has many more of these that are absent in parallels in Matthew. For instance, the nickname Boanerges, the sons of thunder, Talitha Kumi, arise little girl, Ephatha, be opened, Abba, in the prayer in Gethsemane that Jesus says, Eloi, Eloi, from the cross, Jesus says. These are all Aramaic words. Now the question is, would Mark have added these where they had been absent in Matthew with translations for them? Or is it not maybe a little more likely that Matthew would have omitted them if he was in fact writing at somewhat later time when more Christians were living outside Palestine or weren't familiar with the Aramaic? Might these also suggest that Mark is really closer to the oral tradition? Okay, well, what else? Well, Mark's composition strategy. Mark's gospel overall is much shorter than Matthew and Luke, and with Augustine, it does on the surface at least look possible that he could have abridged Matthew's stories, like his baptism story is a lot shorter than Matthew's, his temptation of Jesus is a lot shorter. But in fact, if making his gospel shorter was the goal, and that was the point, how do we explain that most of Mark's stories are actually a lot longer than the parallels in Matthew? Sometimes a lot longer. See, for instance, the stilling of the storm. Compare the Matthew and Mark version, the healing of Jairus' daughter. the healing of the demoniac boy, the purity laws and the tradition of the elders in Mark 7 versus Matthew 15. All of these are considerably longer in Mark than in Matthew. The Gadarene demoniac requires 20 verses for Mark to narrate, and it only takes 9 verses for Matthew. And the other thing is weird is Mark's longer stories don't seem obviously more theologically dense. They just have more narrative detail. Now, if Mark had wanted to make a shorter gospel, why do this? Would he really consider that he needed to know so much more about the Gadarene demoniac's trials and tribulations and antics before he was healed by Jesus? Why do that? Would he have thought that his readers really needed to know that Jesus was having them sit on the green grass, or that when Jesus stilled the storm, there were other boats in the water, or the fact that Jesus was originally asleep in the stern on a cushion in the back of the boat? These are all sort of narrative details that don't add a lot of actual theological content. There's a 4-verse explainer of purity laws in Mark 7. Here's the question though, is it more likely that Mark added these things to spice up the stories of Matthew and Luke, or is it more likely that Matthew and Luke saw Mark's stories as capable of being condensed at no real cost to their theological content? Now, most people who've looked at it have judged the latter is more likely. Now, on the other hand, once again, vivid details might suggest a greater proximity for Mark to the oral tradition, which would be the case if he were really the first. Fourth, Mark's names. Now, here are other little features in the gospel too. The names. Mark often supplies names where they're absent in Mark. For instance, Mark tells us that the dead daughter's dad was Jairus, and that the blind man on the road to Jericho was Bartimaeus, and that Simon of Cyrene had 2 sons, Alexander and Rufus. Now, Matthew doesn't feature any of these names. Now, could this be because Mark's tradition was formed at an earlier time when Christians still knew these people and in fact could ask them about their brush with greatness, their experiences with Jesus, while Matthew tended to be a little less interested in what was for a later generation just names without any real identity attached to them. Now, these are some basic literary considerations which tend to support Markan priority. Which brings us to number 5, Mark's harder readings. And I'm going to look at the harder readings firstly concerning Jesus himself. This is another telling consideration. That's Mark's rougher-edged portrait of Jesus himself, the hero of his gospel. Jesus gets angry in Mark explicitly in Mark 3:5, and in fact, depending on the variant, also in Mark 1:41. That never happens explicitly in the other gospels. His own friends and family seize him and declare him insane. That happens in Mark 3:20 and 21. While he was actually unable to work miracles on one occasion in Mark 6:6. Only in Mark does Jesus require 2 attempts to heal the blind man in Mark 8:22, while only in Mark does he heal the deaf man through the bizarre ritual of sticking his fingers in the man's ears, touching his tongue, and spitting. Jesus seems to distance himself from the goodness and divinity in Mark 10. Now, each of these difficulties is, of course, either glossed over or smoothed over or removed entirely in Matthew and Luke. You can take a closer look at some of these in the harder readings in Mark that I distributed to you earlier this week. Is it easier to believe that Mark introduced into the gospel tradition difficulties for Christology of the early church? Or is it easier to think that Matthew and Mark found some of these minor difficulties in Mark and cleaned them up? Most people think the second one. Then, of course, we also have Mark's harder readings concerning the disciples. For their part, the disciples in Mark fail to understand the parable of the sower. In fact, they're really portrayed as quite stupid in many cases. They often address Jesus sharply. They're described as hard-hearted in Mark 6:56 and rather silly, dumb, grasping not understanding the meaning of the multiplication of the loaves in Mark 8:24 through 26. In Mark, without exception, the disciples address Jesus as teacher, whereas in Matthew, they always address him as Lord. Now, is it easier to believe that Mark expunged every reference to Lord on the lips of the disciples for teacher, or that Matthew thought it more fitting that the disciples call Jesus Lord? Again, the disciples get much better press in Matthew and Luke when you look at the details, the parallels passages. Now, this is the fact that most people believe indicates that Matthew and Luke enhanced the portrait of the disciples that they found in Mark, rather than Mark diminished the depiction of the disciples that he found in Matthew and Luke. Now, in fairness, one might ask, are there also harder readings present in Matthew or Luke, which might vitiate the force of these types of examples? Well, I think it's fair to say that the advocates of the Griesbach hypothesis have been actually fairly hard-pressed to produce many counterexamples. Well, the biggest thing of all, Mark's bizarre decision of what to include and exclude in his gospel. This is, in my judgment, is the biggest problem with Matthean priority. It completely makes Mark look foolish in terms of his gospel content, in terms of his overall compositional strategy. I mean, to believe Mark synthesized Matthew and Luke is to believe that Mark completely rejected two infancy narratives. He didn't like the shepherds, he didn't like the magi, he didn't like the Annunciation, didn't want any of that. Okay? In exchange, what did he give us? He gave us the blind man whom Jesus needed 2 attempts to heal. A story that's so weird, it's one of the few stories in any of the gospel tradition that's not even read in the lectionary today. Mark is the evangelist most apt to call Jesus teacher, but strangely elected to include a ton of teachings that were available to him in Matthew and Luke under this hypothesis. In exchange, what do we get? Well, we get a 4-verse parable of the seed sown in secret. That's Mark's unique contribution to this, whereas he would have excluded dozens of really good parables that he could have found in Matthew and Luke. Mark also decided against even giving us the Lord's Prayer, even in Luke's shorter form. Mark would have rejected both the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain. Don't need either of those. Instead, what does he give us? What he thinks the gospel needs is this 2-verse story of the man running away naked in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the deaf man, of course, healed by Jesus when Jesus again sticks his fingers in his ears, touches his tongue, and spits. Now, if Mark's purpose in doing all of this was to sort of humanize Jesus or humanize the disciples or re-primitivize the tradition or make his gospel more mysterious, as it is sometimes claimed, we couldn't help but assess the whole effort as a complete abject failure. Mark's gospel, throughout almost all of church history, has had almost no effect on the church's Christology, that is, the understanding of Jesus, or the understanding of the disciples, or the ecclesiology, especially in comparison to the other gospels. Mark was by far the least popular gospel in antiquity, the least commented on by the fathers and the medievals, the least copied, the least referenced in homilies, the least meditated upon in monasteries. Whatever Mark was trying to do, it seems to have captured almost no one's imagination in antiquity. What it comes down to then is this: if Matthew is the first gospel, why would anybody care about Mark at all? Nearly everything that's found in Mark is also in Matthew, and in a much more cleaned up form that's amenable to church teaching and church theology. Usually the only reason, in fact, anyone in antiquity would go to Mark at all is to explain away something that's difficult, to explain away some problematic verse or another. Under Matthean priority, Mark looks almost like the accidental gospel, as if someone happened to pick Mark out of the dumpster moments before the weekly trash truck arrived. And indeed, Some early critics working on the assumption of Matthean priority argued just this. And this brings us, I would say, to the final reason, the most important reason of all to accept Markan priority. And this is a German word, Brauchbarkeit, the German word for usefulness, for serviceability. Regardless of what one thinks of the synoptic problem, it is inescapable that the real appreciation of Mark's gospel has come only in the 20th century. And this is when the popularity of Markan priority has dramatically increased. There's no coincidence there. The theory of Markan priority has dramatically increased scholarly interest in understanding this neglected evangelist. So I tend to be a lot more philosophical about this. It's much easier to explain Mark as being the first evangelist. He then becomes the one who invented the idea of a written gospel. He provides Matthew and Luke their basic storyline that they could work from. Mark uses marvelous compositional techniques on his own also, but these can be much more easily seen when Mark steps out from under Matthew's shadow. Indeed, it's probably due to the first line of Mark's gospel, where he says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, that these lives of Jesus came accidentally probably to be known as gospels in the first place. Now, all of these are very significant contributions to the gospel tradition, one that makes much more sense of why God would inspire a fourfold gospel as opposed to a 3.1-fold gospel tradition the other way. Indeed, it doesn't do any disrespect at all to Matthew, even if in doing this we admit that, yeah, okay, he probably added lots of new material to an existing story frame, both because the material that he adds itself is fascinating and because his finished product really is his own meticulous composition. It does the castle builder no dishonor at all to admit that he expanded a charming, if rustic, starter cottage. The belief in Markan priority for these reasons commands a pretty sizable majority among New Testament scholars today, upwards of around 80 or 90% in surveys. That's probably about as high level as consensus as you can get for something like this, given the fact that the evidence that we have is mostly pretty circumstantial. Now, even though we are rejecting the main pillar of the Griesbach hypothesis, we still have to decide between the two-source hypothesis and the Ferrer hypothesis. Now recall that both these theories hold to Markan priority. The difference between them, however, comes down to how we explain the double tradition material. Now, once again, the double tradition material is the some 200 verses that Matthew and Luke share in common with each other, but which is not found in Mark at all. This includes well-known material like the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, the story of the healing of the centurion's boy, the parable of the shepherd with the 99 sheep who goes in search of the lost one. Now, where did this material come from? Did Matthew and Luke derive this material from a third hypothetical source known as Q? That's what the two-source hypothesis holds. Or did Luke get it from Matthew, as the Ferrer hypothesis holds? Well, that's actually a much harder question, and really it's going to require a much closer look later in the course, probably when we study Luke's gospel. For now, just a few general thoughts about the synoptic problem. The late Catholic scholar Raymond Brown was almost surely correct when he points out that absent new data, the synoptic problem is not going to be a problem that can be solved to everybody's satisfaction. And then in fact, the real story of the synoptic interdependence, what really happened, in other words, is probably more complex than the most complex theory. Now, this admission from not only who for many years was the dean of Catholic scholars, but a staunch advocate of himself of the two-source hypothesis, it reminds us all that one key fact that's usually lost in the debate. whatever hypothesis you choose, and you don't have to agree with me or Dr. Wordle, it's not going to do full justice to the complexity of the data. Now, the question is, does this mean that all hypotheses are basically useless and we should just denounce the problem as unsolvable and go on? No. Many problems in life demand a practical solution with less than perfect apprehension of the relevant facts. In a complex system, and this is definitely a complex system, like the interdependence of the Gospels, oftentimes the best we can hope for is a model that adequately explains most of the data most of the time that we find. Now, a good analogy for this might serve. In economics, not analogy here, go with me here, we'll never know exactly what caused the previous recession. We'll never know what caused the previous boom or what's going to cause the next recession or the next boom. This is because much of the data, if it's known at all, is going to be very complicated and, not surprisingly, it's going to be subject to many conflicting interpretations. So what we're left with is theoretical models, which try to interpret the past and through this make recommendations for the future. All the major models, Keynesian, classical, Austrian, monetarist, and so on and so forth, have something to recommend themselves. They can explain what's going on at least some of the time, but none of the models works every time. It's important to remember then that whatever hypothesis for the synoptic problem we choose, and again, we're not necessarily bound to only one, okay? Your solution that you choose is going to be more like a model and less like a demonstrable fact of history. In other words, what we're saying if we adopt, say, the two-source hypothesis is not that Matthew copied Mark and we can prove this mathematically, but rather it seems like a pretty good approximation of most of Matthew's literary strategy to suppose that he started with Mark. That seems like a pretty good, reasonable approximation that explains the data. Okay, that's a good place to stop for now. I'm going to post this video and accompany it with a version with a little practice question so you can see how much of this you retain.